In the fall of 1942, I began college up at Bowdoin in Maine, and 3.5 years later, I left the Navy. After several assignments throughout the United States in the Navy, in Florida, flying off the coast, I wound up in San Francisco at Bombardier School. From there, I went on board the USS Pocomoke, and we sailed for the South Pacific. And all of the scenes that you've seen in the old newsreels, as well as plays and theater, all take place from there down to Manus Island and the Admiralty Islands, where we prepared for the invasion of the Philippines. While down there, I'll always remember pulling into the harbor, and an ammunition supply ship had blown up the evening before, and there was nothing but, as they said, a hole in the water. In any event, at the invasion of Palawan and in the Philippines at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, I came across a situation that I've always promised myself I would hold testimony to. On the beach of Palawan, the Japanese prison camp dug a trench and put into it 150 American and Australian prisoners. And as the invasion began, they lit them with gasoline and burned them alive and bayoneted them as they tried to get out of the trench. And that scene and watching it coming in there after it happened has always lived in my mind on all these years. And I've always said to myself that somehow, somewhere, I'd tell their story, because I always wondered what kind of message did their families get? Were they just telegrams, or did they just kind of disappear from sight? But anyhow, on from there, and that was just something that years later I saw in the newspaper accounts of the war criminal trials in Japan, a small, tiny mention of an occurrence on Palawan, and thus did 150 Australians and Americans simply disappear from view. So this gives me my chance to articulate something that I always promised myself that I would do. From there I went over to Princeton University, where we were told that we would become very fast ensigns, officers, and in charge of invasion craft for the coming Battle of Japan. Ironically enough, years later here in Westport, I find a friend of mine who was also going to be on this program, named Ray Orr, was also at Princeton, had also come in from the fleet, as we were called, and were getting ready to invade Japan. And for those who wonder about the importance of the A-bomb, I can only tell you that in the Navy we were told that the cost of invasion craft and the importance of having officers on as many landing craft as possible was absolutely the forefront of in our minds. And I have no question in my own mind as to the cost to this country in lives and treasure that would have been required to ever accomplish an invasion of Japan islands themselves. And I can only thank all the, whatever may be, whether it be the President Truman or the Congress or the admirals and generals that led us, that we did use the bomb, because I'm sure that probably very few of us would be around today to talk as we are now. And so I asked myself, why am I here? And I really don't have any answers any more than the other guys in this program will. And so maybe in another context, from South Pacific, the only answer is wise men, let's see, fools tell you reason and wise men don't even try, and maybe that's why we're here today. For that I thank myself and the gods that be.
I graduated from high school in '43 in June, and went right off to Wesleyan University to start my college career, which was what you had to do in those days. Hurry up. I applied to a number of things and finally got into the ASTP program the Army was running. The estimates on D-Day casualties were forwarded to the powers that be, with which they made many changes, among which was wiping out, absolutely wiping out the ASTP program. It was in colleges all over the country, and we all were out of that and into the infantry, bang. So I turned up at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, and took 17 weeks of infantry basic. And then I was sent to Camp Pickett, Virginia, assigned to the 78th Infantry Division. We went into New York and onto the General George O. Squire Army troop ship to France. So then that was leading right up to combat. We were committed. So the next morning we jumped off and we're walking down the road, and right away we're under fire. First artillery, then mortar. It's pitch black dark, and the stuff starts coming in around us, so we all hit the dirt. Well, we'd been trained better, but we were carrying our rifles at sling, you know, over your shoulder with the strap, the leather strap, which was called a sling. And boy, I went right down and into the muck and mire, and my rifle went over my shoulder and right down into the mud. And about 5 minutes later, as we turned off the road and up toward a house, now we're under heavy small arms fire, it's time to start shooting back. And I know this rifle's got a mud block in it, and I've been seeing the training films that showed how the rifle barrel would explode and destroy your body. But the guys are shooting at you, you don't know what to do, so I just held the thing up over my head as far as I could hold it and fired 2 rounds. Fortunately, the mud was soft enough, it cleared the barrel, and we went through that day's combat, which culminated late in the afternoon with a second lieutenant who had been sent to us out of the Air Force about 3 weeks beforehand. He had literally no training. Apparently he couldn't read a map. Sent our whole platoon forward into our own artillery fire. We had casualties all over the place. And that brings me to one of my best stories for me. There was a fellow named Ralph Olagino, a big heavy-set guy from Bridgeport, who had been a medic and who had been arrested and busted unfairly. He was ill, and he was in a town, and he looked like he was drunk, and they said he was drunk, and he wasn't. And they busted his and made him an infirmary. He was right there with us, but he had been our medic. And these shells are going off, and guys are hurt, people are yelling and screaming, and the medic is standing there, and somebody said, "Get a go!" And he said, "I don't have to go." Well, he was right. Their training was you were supposed to wait until the heavy fire stopped, or else you would be chewing up medics left and right. And Ralph Olagino looked at this guy and says, "Give me those kits." And he just tore them out of his hand and ran forward into this thing. The fire is coming in all around him. He tends to 3 or 4 guys. They got some stretcher bearers up, and he was awarded the Silver Star for that gallantry. We'd only been in a few days when the Battle of the Bulge began. The attack came just to our right. So we wound up being on the right flank of the Battle of the Bulge in the worst winter. You can see from some of these pictures, the worst winter they'd had in 20 years in Europe. Ice and snow, just, you know, terrible, cold, sub-freezing. And you've heard about these things. This was the Battle of the Bulge, and it was bad. There are some houses behind us in a little town. We're dug in front of that in what was called foxholes. You dug a foxhole, but then you dug a side channel for where 2 guys could lie down and sleep. And then you cover that with whatever you could find, doors from the houses or barns, and then dirt on top of that, and, you know, tried enough to stop pieces of fragments of shell from coming through it. And then, of course, one guy awake all the time, all night long, and it was tough. It was cold, and it was mean, and it was nasty, and it was miserable. Well, I had my 19th birthday in that foxhole, and we were sitting there, you know, we were in a stationary position because of the bulge. We couldn't attack or move forward. We were supposed to be like the anvil for the patent hammer to drive up against. We took the Roar River dams, moved forward through minefields, which were an extraordinary experience. The first people to go through would be killed, and when you got up there, the bodies would still be there. The guys that were killed, those who were hurt, were dragged out, but the people who were killed were still there. And you went through these minefields in soft earth, stepping in the steps of the person in front of you, till finally these footsteps were as deep as the top of your boot. It was ridiculous, but that's the only way you could get through. And while we were doing that and crawling along an edge of an embankment, I came around and there was a guy there. He wasn't going forward. He was just sitting there up against the embankment. And I got right up to him before I realized that he was stone cold dead. He'd been shot, and he was still there, and we were moving forward because you're always leapfrogging and jumping one unit over the other. But that was something I've never forgotten, looking right into this guy's face and realizing that he was totally dead. I lost many friends. I was, by that time, the ripe old age of 19, and one of the fellows who was a medic, another medic, named Rig, and or Reagan, actually, I'm taking Reagan for the president. Reagan was 26 years old, a very old person. And he was like a mentor to me and kind of kept my head on straight after some of these rough experiences. And then that one of those days he was killed, I was not next to him, so I heard about it. And I hardly was able to keep going. It was so destroying because this was the one thing that I had to hang on to, this young guy who took me under his wing. But anyway, we went on, went forward, we did things. One day we walked 40 miles. Through the rough terrain of Germany and towns and so forth because we had to keep moving it forward. We got out into the Cologne plain and went across there. I had an experience in the middle of that. We took a prison, not a prison camp, but a prison, and we had to go in and blow the gates off it because the Germans had just pulled out, and we were still under fire. And it was full of what were called prisoners. Slave labor prisoners. These were guys who'd been soldiers or been civilians, and they were all dragged in there, and they were making munitions and building airplanes in the insides of mountains and whatnot. Well, we blow all the gates off, and these guys start coming forth, and one of the guys was in a French Army uniform. Now, I had 3 years of high school French, so I started to strike up a conversation with him, and we spoke for a moment, and then he started to walk away. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Home." I said, "Where's home?" And he mentioned a town that's several hundred miles away from where we were. But this guy walked out the gates in the prison, and he was going home. He was going to walk home. When we got to the Remagen Bridge, and we thought we were going to have a week or two, to take it easy. We pulled up on the edge of the Rhine River, and we weren't there for half an hour when the word came down that they captured the Remagen Bridge upriver from where we were, and that we were to go across it. And the 9th Armored Division had contacted. My division was the 78th Infantry. You'll see this lightning-shaped patch, and that's the infantry patch. And got across, got up to the Rhine River, and we went across. It was dark. It was a railroad bridge that had been bombed and shelled and was full of holes. They'd laid some planks on it, and then they were blown with all. And as we went across, we lost 2 or 3 men who just disappeared down through these holes. It was that black, and you couldn't see where you were going. And they were trying to bring across tanks and trucks and jeeps and march guys across all at the same time. So it was chaotic. We got up into the bridgehead and got in a firefight, several dandy firefights up there. I remember walking one woods path, and all of a sudden there was tracer coming right across in front of me. Tracer is bullets that are lit up with the phosphorus that are loaded. It's so a gunner can fire and see where his shells are going. They would load like tracer space 5 every 5th bullet would be. I see these tracers coming across in front of me. And we all hit the dirt and figured out where they were coming from, and then went after the machine gunner. And we were on the side of a hill, and I was carrying a 536 radio, little handheld platoon radio, and I got a call from my platoon lieutenant, and I could see these slugs hitting the trees above me and taking off bits and pieces, and I was well below it. So I got up on my knees because he couldn't hear me, and I yelled out for him, at which point one of them went right through my shoulder. So that was my Purple Heart. And speaking of that, you'll see the medals here, but I have to tell you that I don't think medals mean much. It depends on where you were, who saw what you were doing. There were many heroes that didn't get any kind of recognition at all. And the one that means the most to me is the simple combat infantry badge. That's that blue badge with a rifle on it and the wreath around it. Only people who fought in an infantry war ever get to wear that. I think that means something a lot more than medals, which were very catch as catch can. Eventually, I got into an aid station a day or two later. Doc had me take off my boots, and he took one look at my feet. He said, "You got a terrible case of trench feet." I said, "Well, what's that?" I had never heard of it then. He said, "Well, it's your ticket out of here." And we went out in ambulances across. We'd been told, by the way, that the Remagen Bridge fell down. Nobody bothered to tell us that they put up a whole bunch of pontoon bridges. So we didn't know what was going on. We get out, and of course, this ambulance went across a pontoon bridge to a Aerovac, grass strip, C-47 hospital and treatment there, and taken care of. Well, went back to Germany and was very busy learning how to fight the Japanese. Very serious training about the Japanese, at which point the atomic bomb was dropped. My reflections on it are very simple. It was a horrendous experience for a kid. I concur with my friend Jack Schwartz, who feels that war is a terrible answer to anything. But I do want to say on the other side of that coin from where I was, We felt, and I think it was the only thing that kept us going, that we were fighting a just war. Nazism was horrendous. The pictures are true, the stories are true. Never let anyone say that those camps didn't exist, that those people weren't murdered by the millions. They were. And I think at that point in time, I don't think we had any choice. So we fought that war.
In 1942, I was 23 years old, single, with a good job, and champing at the bit to fight Hitler and Hirohito. So, at my own expense, I bought a train ticket from New York to Baltimore and enlisted at Camp Meade, now Fort Meade. I'd been told that I could get into the intelligence service by enlisting from there. 3 days later, I was on a train to Alexandria, Louisiana, to Camp Beauregard, a very sad private in an MP company. After a couple of days as an MP, I was transferred to Station Complement and assigned to the staff of the Camp S2. That was an intelligence and public relations officer. I also did some broadcasting on station KALB, which at that time was the only radio station in Alexandria. In May 13, 1943, I was a full-fledged second lieutenant in the field artillery with orders to report to Camp Roberts, California. We sailed to New Guinea in June of '44. 3 ships, the 756th, the 757th, and the 760th Field Artillery. 3 Liberty ships, no convoy, zigzagging for 30 days in full blackout through the Pacific until we got to New Guinea, not far from Itapi. In New Guinea, we were all the time rain, humidity, wet. Jungle rot was prevalent. A little malaria from those dopes who didn't take the Ativan that was given to them. We were short of a lot of things: socks, shoes, sometimes rations, sometimes ammunition, because the main war was going on in Europe. And one day we were rationed to just 10 rounds per gun. Well, the quartermaster truck showed up, and we're all running to see what we finally got, all the stuff we needed. And the first thing we saw was about 15 cartons of condoms. Now, if you can imagine anything more useless in the jungle in New Guinea than condoms, you got a great imagination. The troops went wild. They started blowing them up, making balloons out of them, and then we raised hell with them because they were giving away our position. Right after the 1st of January in 1945, we were part of an enormous convoy. Ships as far as the eye could see in any direction. I've never seen anything like it. We were on our way to Lingayen Gulf to make the Luzon operation. The thing that I'll never forget was a kamikaze pilot who crashed into an ammunition ship behind us. The explosions, the screams, the horror, the flames, unbelievable. Kind of a forerunner in a way of what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. We landed at Lingayen on D+1. I don't remember the date, but it was sometime in January. We were 6th Corps Artillery, and we fought all the way down past Manila to Batangas. In the Philippines, I got an extra $60 a month as an observer on an L4, that's a Piper Cub. Great for reconnaissance and also for adjusting artillery fire. Near a town called San Jose, which was, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 miles north of Manila, we were taking mortar fire as we were going into position, and that is when an artillery battery is most vulnerable because they can't shoot. So the colonel ordered me to go up and locate where they were coming from and bring fire down on them. Well, as Lieutenant Guglielmo and I took off, we flipped over. Now you got to remember that an airfield in the Philippines consisted of nothing more than a bulldozer running 3 or 4 times over a rice paddy. The rice paddies are all square. You've seen them, I'm sure, with humps all around to mark the square. Well, this hump wasn't bulldozed down enough. We flipped over, didn't catch fire. I was conscious. The pilot was knocked unconscious. Fortunately, there was a battalion aid station right nearby who saw the whole thing. So they came running up and took care of us, brought us into the, well, it was a hospital that had been an agricultural school, and they put us down in front of the entrance where they were bringing in guys that were really shot up, coming off patrols and so on and so forth. As luck would have it, I can't remember how much longer it was before we saw a Catholic chaplain come by, and he was giving, you know, as much succor and comfort as he could. And to the guys that were dead, he started doing the last rites. And my buddy was unconscious. And he said to me, why don't you and I say a prayer, because he knew I wasn't Catholic, say a prayer for the troops that are on patrol. And I said, fine. And he said, what about your buddy? I said, well, he's Catholic. So he starts, the guy's unconscious. He starts to give him the last rites. At which time this guy got up and he looked around. He thought he was dead. It seems awful funny now, but it really wasn't at the time. The next morning, we're now on a cot in this hospital. And the general comes in, and as long as you're on a cot in the hospital, it doesn't make any difference why you're there, everybody gets a Purple Heart. And he's just put him out. Hi, buddy, how you doing? Purple Heart, everywhere. When he got to me, I said, General, I don't want a Purple Heart. Why not? I said, first of all, I'm really not hurt all that bad. But more important, my mother has a rheumatic heart, and if she gets a telegram saying that her son was slightly wounded, I don't know how the hell she would react. So thank you, but no thanks. Now, Guglielmo by this time is very compos mentis, and he turns down a Purple Heart too. The general was astounded. He had a better reason than I did. His mother was a widow. His brother was in Europe, the only 2 sons she had. Well, I'll tell you, some months later, I wished I'd had that Purple Heart, because if I'd had those 5 points, I could have gone home a hell of a lot earlier. Our mission in the Philippines was to reinforce the fires of the 1st Cavalry and the 11th Airborne. They're still arguing as to who got to Japan first. We're not part of that argument. We know we got there third. We arrived shortly after Labor Day in 1945. I was now a first lieutenant and commanding Battery C. I was assigned a 100 square mile sector responsible for enforcing the Allied surrender terms, which were to destroy enemy materiel, to administer collections of Japanese, to administer the collection of Japanese weapons. This sword happens to be the one that belonged to the commandant of the base that we were living at, and where we burned 100 naval fighter planes, 4 of which were Zeros that our government didn't know about. See, we couldn't do anything with naval material until naval intelligence came up from Yokohama and gave us clearance. And they were astounded to find 4 planes that they didn't know anything about. These were brand new Zeros that may not have yet been in combat. I really don't know that for a fact. But I do know that they flew 2 of the planes back to Yokohama and then came back with a crew and crated up the other 2 and shipped them back to the States for study. I left Japan on the 31st of January of 1946, took a troop ship to San Pedro, California. From there, a troop train to Fort Dix. Checked in on February 23rd, 1946, 5 days ahead of my 27th birthday.
In the summer of 1941, I thought I really had it made. I had just graduated from college. I had a plush job as the manager of the swimming pool at the Congressional Country Club just outside of Washington, and I was enrolled in the Harvard Law School that September. But came mid-August, I get greetings from the president that my draft number was up. So instead of going to law school, I went to basic training down at Camp Croft, South Carolina for 13 weeks. At that time, we were told that we would just go in for 1 year and then we'd be out and be in the reserves. So we started out getting $21 a day, once a month, as recruits. I was home on a weekend pass on December the 7th, sitting in the living room with my father watching the Washington Redskins when I heard that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor, and we got word to get back to our base immediately. So back I went and finished up our basic training, and then I applied for officer candidate school and went to Fort Benning, Georgia for 13 weeks to become they call them a 60-day wonder. And I graduated from the OCS class in April of 1942, and along with my commission, they gave me orders to go overseas. We weren't even supposed to tell our parents where we were going, but we were going to Hawaii, so off I went to Hawaii. And Hawaii at the time was really in danger of being invaded by the Japanese. So I reported to Schofield Barracks and was assigned to the 27th Infantry Regiment, a famous Wolfhound Regiment of the 25th Division. So we were there until the Battle of Midway, which ended the Japanese hope of ever attacking Hawaii and invading it. But instead, we ended up on Guadalcanal. And at that time, the Marines held a perimeter around Henderson Field, and our job was to go in and relieve those weary Marines who were all suffering from malaria, dysentery, and fatigue. And our job was to push the Japanese off the island. We were very successful in doing that in just a little over a month. And our division commander was J. Lawton Collins, who later became Chief of Staff. And he did such a good job there and so quick that he was called Lightning Joe Collins. And then that name stuck to the division, and our division patch became a taro leaf, signifying that we came from Hawaii with a lightning bolt in it. So after Guadalcanal was over, we set up camp there for a while and lived a sort of a semi-normal life. They were having a tough time up at New Georgia. They were trying to capture the Munda Airport up there, and they needed some help, so they sent the 25th Division up there. And we very quickly managed to clean up that situation too. My battalion was assigned to a little island called Arundel. And as we were, just after we disembarked from the landing craft and were moving up towards the combat area, I passed a hasty grave on the side of the path. And it had a cross and a mess kit on it with the name of the party that was buried there. And I read it, and it was a classmate of mine from college, John Corbett, who had been the captain of our track team. And he had joined the Marines at the end of his junior year. And the Marines had apparently sent a patrol into this little island in Arundel just before we were there, and John was killed there. So after we captured Arundel and New Georgia was cleaned up, we went to the island of Kolombangara, which was the northernmost of the of the Florida Islands, and we stayed there for. We were lucky when we landed there expecting a fight, but the Japanese had already left, so we stayed there for a short while, and then we were brought back to Guadalcanal on transports that were World War I destroyers with some of the stacks taken out and bunks put in for troops. So we went back to Guadalcanal for a very short while, and one of the notable things about that little visit was Admiral Halsey came to our CP one day and gave our battalion commander, Joe Renesca, a bottle of whiskey. They had become friends back in Hawaii when Joe Renesca was on beach defense at Doris Duke's home, and Doris Duke used to entertain all these big brass. But so then after we were at Guadalcanal, just a matter of a few weeks, we went to New Zealand for a little rest and rehabilitation, which was very much needed because a lot of us had suffered from malaria. I personally had malaria, dengue fever, and hepatitis, among other things. And we all had these jungle sores on us, where anytime you skinned your shin or something, it would fester and get into a runny sore. And it was amazing. As soon as we got into the temperate climate of New Zealand, all these things went away. And we had a wonderful 3-month stay in New Zealand. Then we went to New Caledonia for several months of training for the Luzon campaign. And in November of '44, we landed at Lingayen Gulf on the initial landings. And it was a very uneventful landing. The Japanese had decided not to defend the coast, but to set up defenses further in. And it was a very fluid situation to begin with because we were in the plains area. And I was at that time the executive officer of the division reconnaissance troop. And we immediately started long-range reconnaissance with our jeeps and half-tracks. And eventually the Japanese withdrew up into the mountains, and our objective was to get up to Baliti Pass, which entailed rooting the Japanese out of one ridge after another until we got up to the pass and into the Cagayan Valley. And some other divisions turned the other way and went down to Manila and had to fight the Battle of Manila. So we were in combat, our division, on Luzon for 165 consecutive days. That doesn't mean I was in all that time, but units of the division were. And after the Luzon campaign was over, we set up camp and were awaiting orders to go to Japan. And actually, the orders were already drawn up. We knew exactly which island we were to hit on Japan. So we were very thankful when the atomic bomb was dropped and ended the hostilities. When the armistice was signed, we were sent over to the occupation troops. And that was I was almost ready for rotation, but I was glad to go to Japan just to see what it was like, and it was a most interesting experience. The Japanese had just turned around completely. Their emperor told them to be nice to us, and they were. And we had no trouble at all with hostilities over there. And I was working in close collaboration with the police chief in Nagoya, patrolling the streets and everything with our jeeps and half-tracks. And when I got word that I was going home, the police chief said, "I'd like to have a party for you and your officers." And I gladly accepted. And I think the police chief gave us our little sake cups to take home as a souvenir, and I lost those. But he gave each of us a little brass cigarette holder. The cigarette stands up top like a pipe, and I've managed to hang on to this all these years. So I was there only in Japan for 6 weeks, and then I was rotated home. And I ended up having 42 months overseas duty and 4.5 years total duty. And I had been through all that without ever having a leave. So when I got home, I had 4 months terminal leave. So that's my story.
I joined at the Prairie State in Manhattan, and it was 1941, and I left in 1944. Initially, I had the rank of midshipman, and over the course of several years, was graduated in the end as a lieutenant commander. The South Pacific was my theater of combat. I was the first initially torpedo officer destroyer named USS Waller DD 466, and during the course of the war we made many runs up and down what we called the slot, which was a pathway route through several South Pacific islands. The outstanding memory I have of those years concerns rescuing some Navy men whose ship had been shot down and hauling them up the sides on the cargo net was a real important memory of the war for me. To save people, Jack, you and I know, is very gratifying. Well, it had to do with a torpedo action at night, and I was at that point, I was the torpedo officer of the USS Waller. And it was a thrill to help save men. As far as the Silver Star Medal itself goes, I think it was attributed to a night torpedo action in a place in the Solomons called Kula Bay. Kula Bay. And we fired a spread of torpedoes, or 2 spreads, and it seems that we sank some Japanese ships. My wife reminds me that it probably was real hairy with the kamikaze overhead. And we did have planes close aboard, Japanese planes close aboard, on several occasions. On one occasion we had a Japanese submarine within a few yards, and so close were we that the normal gunnery procedures had to be put aside, and we ended up more or less in hand-to-hand battle. That all these things should happen to me, a nudnik from New York. How do you figure?
My name's Frank Evans, and I was in the British Army. Back in 1939, I was 19 years old, and Hitler had entered Europe, and Germany had taken over Czechoslovakia and was now headed for Poland, and so the British declared war on Hitler. And this was, so in September 1939, I was taken into the army in the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers. And then I was assigned to the 1st Armored Division, and we were sent to France to try to break this German movement, which was now headed towards France. Well, when we landed, as you see from the map, we landed in Le Havre, and we headed up the coast and joined the French army and tried to get into Belgium, and into the Netherlands. And then on May the 28th, the Germans circumvented the French and moved down with their big Panzer armored divisions and headed towards us, and our troops had to try to escape, because the King of Belgium on that day, May the 28th, capitulated, and that meant that the Germans could come right through Belgium. Now, you perhaps have all heard about Dunkirk. Well, Dunkirk was a big action in a small village. The small village was right on the coast, and it was the closest to England that you could get without getting in the water. And so we had all our troops, not just our tanks, but all the armored people, but also all the infantry and so on, try to gather together down on the beach at Dunkirk, in the hopes that somehow some of them would get away. Well, our division, our armored division, was suddenly finding itself pushing the Germans back, the big Panzer division, and we thought we were winning this battle. Well, it turned out that this was just a ploy, and the men on the beach were being strafed by the aircraft and by various guns along the coast, and there were now 500,000 men, mostly British, but some French and some Dutch. And then the call was made in England to go try to rescue these people. And everybody who had a little boat in England joined in this big crusade, let's say, this big attempt to get these men off the beach. And for 5 days they went back and forth, and they were being protected to some extent by the British Air Force, and they managed to take 360,000 men off the beaches in little boats back to England. Now, that left us in the armored division still fighting the German tanks. But the Germans then turned around, and what they had done was to back up and pull us into a trap. And they then turned around, closed up the trap, and captured most of our tanks and men. I happened to be in the workshops, the field workshops, so this line of German tanks came right in between my tanks and my workshop, and so we just got in our vans, lorries, and we headed south, and we then wandered around for 3 weeks, and until we finally were able to get to Brest, which was about as far south as you could go on the English Channel, and we were able, fortunately, to get a little Dutch coal ship to pull in and to take us off the beach. But we had to run all our trucks, all our armaments, all our personal stuff, everything had to go into the water first. And that's how we finally got back to England. The rest of the war, and this was in 1940, of course, Dunkirk happened, but the rest of the war was spent fighting the Battle of Britain, and that went on for several years. And you all heard about the Blitz, bombing of London, and so on, and the tremendous amount of damage was done there. I was in charge of anti-aircraft, and so we battled that, and we finally won that by the help of the Americans, who provided us with the electronic equipment to tackle these V-1 weapons, which were the pilotless bombs, pilotless planes. And then after that, Hitler made the mistake of invading Russia, and that tied him up quite a bit there. So then came, immediately after that, came Pearl Harbor, and now the Americans declared war, and you know the rest of the story. But that war, which I had hoped when we went in would only last a year, really lasted, for me, 7 years. And so here I am, and I just want to say that the thing that I think I remember most is not only the Battle of the Dunkirk, but the bombs falling on England, but mostly the courage of the people, and how everybody in the country always looked out for the next person. And it was a very nice experience in that sense. But it was a horrible war. There were many, many thousands of people killed, and it's certainly not the way to go if you can possibly avoid it.
I left college after one term early in 1943 and joined the Army. I trained with a glider airborne unit. I was a corporal of a water-cooled 50 caliber machine gun. We trained in Camp Stewart, Georgia for a while until I guess the Army decided the gliders were not all that effective, so they broke us up, and I went overseas as a replacement infantryman. I joined the 40th Division on New Britain, where they were containing the Japanese at the naval base of Rabaul. I'd gone via New Guinea as the first stop and was in hospital there for about a month with malaria, even though I was taking my Ativan. We were prepared, the 4th Division was preparing for the invasion of Luzon in the Philippine Islands, and they needed medics and had not been given any medics in the replacement group, so somebody decided that since I had a little bit of college in, I'd make a good medic. And that was my role, a combat medic with the infantry. I'll give a couple of instances of the kind of action that the unit was involved in. After Luzon, we went to Leyte, kind of late in the cleanup of that island to eliminate the rest of the Japanese there. I remember one time we were attacking a hill and meeting a lot of resistance. We're not able to get to the Japanese, who are pretty firmly entrenched at the top. Finally, some of the guys in the unit themselves just got together, and 3 BAR men with their ammunition helpers lined up and just started walking up the hill, shooting a barrage up to the top, and they made it, and we all joined them at the top of the hill. As a result of that, I picked these binoculars up from around a dead Japanese at the top of the hill. I think he must have been an artillery spotter because they have azimuth and elevation gratings in the lens. A couple of minutes after that, the Japanese who'd retreated the other side of the hill came back in a banzai attack, and one of the BAR men was shot in the chest, but he was able to kill the Japanese that had hit him before he came back. And as a medic, I prepared him for evacuation.
Shortly after that, another Japanese with a samurai sword going for one of our machine gunners didn't quite make it, and he actually sliced through the water jacket of this water-cooled 30 caliber machine gun with his samurai sword, but we got him too. It's interesting, about a month later, I was in hospital on Mindoro and met the BAR man that had been on this hill. What had happened, the Japanese that shot him had a fairly low caliber pistol, a 25 caliber. It hit him right spang in the breastbone, and the bullet, instead of going straight ahead, followed around one of the ribs and didn't do any really serious damage, although it hurt like hell at the time, of course. Back to Luzon, we landed at Lingayen Gulf, worked down the west coast of Luzon towards Clark Field, which was a former American airfield on the island. And when we got down there, we found that although the Japanese planes had been pretty well destroyed by our Air Force, the Japanese had taken the 20 millimeter guns from their aircraft and used those in their defenses. And here was a case where we were fairly seriously outgunned by the Japanese. The 20 millimeter is an explosive shell, and it really wreaks havoc when you use it against infantry or anything. We were attacking as usual down a valley to get up into a hill where the Japanese were well dug in, and a different company from mine had a large number of casualties, so I was asked to go to that company and help evacuate the wounded. I got to the end of the perimeter that our company was maintaining, and with one of the other aid men, we started walking towards the company that had been hit and that needed help evacuating. We passed caves that the Japanese had been holed up in, which had been cleared out by our infantry going up over the cave with 5-gallon cans of gasoline, throwing them into the cave and throwing a grenade in to light the gas and either burn or asphyxiate the Japanese inside. And they pretty well cleared out these caves because we didn't meet any resistance as we went. But the unit that I was going to help had been hit so hard that they started to withdraw, and they began to bring their wounded out on Sherman tanks. So I came back to my own unit with them. We did finally manage to take that position 2 or 3 days later. And in doing it, Clark Field is a little north of Manila, and there was a Japanese prison camp called Cabanatuan, or in the town of Cabanatuan, where guys from the Bataan Death March had been imprisoned. Most of them had unfortunately been sent to Japan on ships before we got there, but our unit did free up about 500 soldiers that had been held since 1942 in Cabanatuan. They were in really pretty bad shape, and it was a shock to see them. The Japanese had not been parties to the Geneva Convention, and they would pick on any unusual person who might be in a leadership position. They'd go after officers or non-commissioned officers or medics or anybody else that might have a unique position that would have to do with the command or the morale of the troops. So none of us wore any kind of insignia. We didn't wear the nice white cross on our helmet that medics in Europe wore. It would have been a nice target for a Japanese sniper. We carried weapons. I had grenades that I would be able to use at night if we were attacked. I started out with a Tommy gun, which is what I'd used in training in the glider airborne, but later went to a Garand M1 rifle, and we used these weapons on occasion, although not often. A fellow medic, though, did get a Japanese sniper that was in a tree. Half of our unit had gone by, and he looked up, saw the sniper, and was able to bring him down. So it was a different kind of experience, what you might expect. Medics were, in fact, combat medics, because the Japanese treated us as such. It turned out, from my point of view, to be one of the best things that could have happened to me, to have been assigned as a medic. Even though I had no prior experience in that field, I was doing a constructive job in an essentially destructive environment. I'm convinced that one of the things that led to what in the Second World War was called combat fatigue was the killing that infantrymen were forced to engage in. It was an unnatural act, and after enough of the destruction and the violence that these guys were forced to engage in, I'm convinced that that led to their emotional problems as much as the fear of being hurt themselves. It just was a hard thing to take. And from my point of view as a medic, I was doing a constructive thing, and I know it helped me get through the particular period involved. I know it's been controversial with revisionist historians, but if you think about it, our use of the atom bomb saved millions of lives, both Japanese and American soldiers, millions of lives. When the atom bomb was used, it finally gave some of the Japanese enough power to overcome the hardcore generals who wanted to pursue the war to the literally bitter end and bring it to a conclusion. Combat led me to decide on the difference between things that are really important and the frivolous extras that really don't count for very much. The things that really matter are pretty basic. Safety, a safe environment, food, shelter, and equally important, being with a group of people that you can count on and that can count on you.
I was a naval officer during World War II. The war broke out when I was in my sophomore year in college, and so at the end of my junior year, they took me on active duty to Columbia University in New York City for my midshipman training. I was commissioned in April of 1944 and was sent to be on temporary duty on a destroyer escort, the USS Swayze. After one trip, one cruise on the destroyer escort across the Atlantic, hunting for submarines, we instituted in the Navy a portion of the ship that had never been there before, called CIC, Combat Information Center, in order to keep informed of what was going on in our area where we were seeking submarines. So the captain told me that I had to make another cruise with them before I was sent for further training. Well, my further training lasted about 30 days on that ship, and they changed my orders while I was out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and I never got off that ship for 22 months. And while I went on board as the youngest officer, a brand new ensign, I ended up, when the war was over, and I decommissioned that ship as the commanding officer. And this is the commission pennant from that ship, which I've had for ever since and treasure very much. After one or two cruises, I was assigned to be a watch officer and stand officer of the deck watches while the ship was underway, and indeed while it was in port. We were part of a group, 6 destroyer escorts, which were known as an escort division. We were commanded by a 3-striper in the Navy, a naval commander who was quartered on one of the other ships, and he was responsible for us out at sea and anything having to do with the general action that we performed. We soon teamed up with a baby flat top, a small carrier, a CVE, actually was CVE 25, the USS Croatan, and we then became a task group. 22.5 was our number, and we were what was known as a hunter-killer group. Whenever a submarine was sighted or it was felt that a submarine was operating in a certain area, the convoys would be diverted from that area and they would send our group in, and hence the name Hunter-Killer. There were about 10 planes on board this small baby flat top, and the 6 destroyer escort's job was to, first of all, screen in front of and astern of the carrier to protect it from submarines, and also to perform plane guard duty. And the other DEs, as I said, performed screening duty to search for submarines using sonar. If we could get a ping, why, everybody on board a destroyer escort was happy, because that shows that we were finding something that we were essentially searching for. We had about 4 radio men on board. They just worried about German code, and they had the ability to break radio silence if necessary if they heard any high-frequency radio signal that they could ascertain came from a submarine. And using the positions of the other ships and a simple mathematical triangulation, we could determine the latitude and the longitude from where the ship was sending out its message. That was a way for us to find where the submarines were, and then immediately we would head towards that particular location. On this particular day, it was in April in 1944, we had such a situation, and when we got to the search area, my ship was one of the ones who was assisting in the search, not protecting the carrier. So 4 of us were out there looking for pings on our sonar gear, and in hopes that we would find this submarine and be able to sink it. We essentially had 2 weapons that were used against submarines. One was a depth charge. The other weapon that we had was what we called a hedgehog. It was a small mortar, and there were about 25 of them set in a square pattern, and we could fire them about 1/10 of a second apart, and they formed a pattern in front of our ship that was about 300 square feet. One of the, in fact, 2 of the destroyer escorts at one particular time heard a report coming back from the hedgehogs that they had fired off into the water. They said that they thought one or more of their hedgehogs had hit the submarine. That was in the afternoon. About 10 o'clock at night, right in the middle of our hunter-killer group, the submarine surfaced. And we were astonished, to say the least, and the members of the crew were jumping into the water. We received a light signal in English code, SOS, save my crew, and the German captain scuttled his ship so that we would not be able to get any of their codes or any other material on board they might consider to be secret. We took aboard, our task group took aboard 62 prisoners. This was what we called a mother sub. It came from Kiel, Germany, on its maiden voyage to deliver diesel fuel and torpedoes and food to the smaller submarines that were the real killers. We got that sub. Everybody in the task group was awarded a battle star because we all participated, and then the Navy decided to send us into Argentia, Newfoundland, with the members of the crew that came out of the water. I was officer of the deck the next day, and on the TBS, that's the talk between ships radio, One of the captains from one of the destroyer escorts got on. He said he wanted to talk to the task group commander. In about 2-3 minutes, the task group commander came on at TBS, and the destroyer escort captain said, I've got the submarine captain aboard my ship, and he thinks he's a member of the master race. He's strutting around here, and it's raising Cain with the morale of my men, and it's raising the morale of the other German submariners that are aboard my ship. What do you think I should do? He came back on and he said, take his pants away. And that was it. And so about 10 minutes later, the destroyer escort captain came back on and he said, you know what? He said, it worked. He says he put his head down, he slunk around, and he says, we're not having any more difficulty. Well, the Navy sent this on into Argentia, Newfoundland, and we had a platoon of Marines meet the ship when it arrived, and they double-timed the crew of that submarine around the island for an hour or so, and then took them to the brig. And that's the end of my story.
I was a medic in a Navy amphibious beach battalion, like a first aid guy in the Pacific. My ship was the USS Gerald, APA, which stands for Amphibious Personnel Assault 174. We nicknamed her the Mary Jerry. And my job was to land with the Marines, take care of the wounded, get them off the beach and back out of the ship, and hopefully get myself out there too. We made the invasion of Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, and it was codenamed Love Day, oddly enough. I expect our intelligence chose Easter Sunday because they probably thought the Japs wouldn't think that we would, Japanese probably thought we wouldn't attack on that holy day, but we did. And contrary to popular opinion, the invasion itself wasn't all that bad. A couple of reasons probably. One of them was it was the last island the Japanese held. It was full of caves, and they had pulled all their artillery and their cannon, whatever they had left, tanks and stuff, back into the caves. The other reason, and this is a major reason, was our underwater demolition teams, called frogmen in those days. And these guys swam in. They had no gear, no underwater breathing gear in those days. They just, their uniform was a set of swim trunks, and their weapon was a knife. And these guys swam underwater, whatever they could hold in their lungs. And they charted a course. They carried slate on their wrist, chalk. They charted a path for us. They got rid of the obstructions that the Japanese had. They had all kinds of wooden posts, telephone poles, I don't know what, sunken stuff there to stop our progress. They got rid of those. They detonated whatever mines the Japanese had laid there for us at horrible peril to themselves. In fact, the night before we went in, we heard of two swimmers that were killed. I never heard of underwater demolition teams before then. So they took care of those, and the last thing they did was on their way back out to the ship, they tied explosives, which they carried around their waist. They tied them, lashed them onto the coral reefs, took the primer cord back out to the ship, and blasted the tops off the coral reefs. So if we had to have gone in at low tide, where we wouldn't be sitting there like sitting ducks. But they cleared the water, and they blasted the tops, and finally we went in. We made the landing without losing a man. It was surprising, and it was wonderful. The first casualty I saw was a Marine who had shrapnel on his ankle, was lying there. And everybody smoked in those days, or practically everybody did. And one of the first things that many medics did, we came on to a wounded guy, was light a cigarette and hand it to him, or put it in his mouth, depending how badly he was. And I did this, and got some morphine into him, and wrapped up the ankle a bit, got him sent out to the ship. And when I finally got through with all the beach work and the carnage was over, I went back out to the ship and to the sick bay to visit this guy. And when I saw him, he looked he looked real sensitive, young, not at all like your typical leatherneck, you know, and I was really surprised. I lit another cigarette and handed it to him, and in a very soft voice he said, "I never smoked before." So much for my first aid.
I grew up in the state of Michigan, and we had a cottage outside of Detroit over in Lake Erie. And I learned to swim there quite a bit, and that was before the war broke out. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, I was in high school, and the draft was going on. I knew there was a program that the Navy had started, which was an officer training program called V-12. So I joined the V-12 program, which puts you in a college. Well, close to graduation, becoming an officer, an ensign, an announcement was made over the loudspeaker to all the midshipmen that they were looking for volunteers for a brand new outfit. That outfit was called Combat Demolition. Since I had learned to swim on Lake Erie quite a bit, I decided that I would volunteer. And the very simple screening process was a master chief who would ask me, he said, well, why do you want to volunteer? I said, well, you know, it sounds like an interesting outfit. And he said, well, how far can you swim? I said, oh, about 3 miles. And he said, that's okay, we'll teach you how to swim. And I must say, they did teach us how to swim. The interesting thing is that combat demolition was first used over in Utah and Normandy beaches and also on the coasts of Africa. And swimming wasn't a requirement. And it was called NCDU, or Naval Combat Demolition Unit. Well, by the time I arrived, they were looking for swimmers because the action and the invasions were going on over in the Pacific Ocean, and they wanted men with a swimming capability. They decided to have swimmers go in and actually survey the beaches and find out what was there in the way of reefs, obstacles, what the beach was like, and how safe would it be, and make it safe for our troops to land. There was a ton of training in swimming and in rubber boat work, and obviously a great amount of blowing things up, use of explosives, and we would work with taking obstacles. There'd be various obstacles that the Seabees would build. They'd spend days building obstacles, and we'd destroy them in a matter of minutes. We had, in World War II, no one used any artificial breathing apparatus like scuba gear. We had to do everything under our own breath. Our uniform was really quite simple. It consisted of a pair of swimming trunks, and here I have my original swim fins that are some 56, 57 years old. These are very heavy rubber fins. We would have a simple face mask like this, just a face mask that we wear over our face, obviously. Then we'd have a knife. This is my original knife, not in the greatest of shape, but we'd have a knife. We would have a wristwatch, not like this, but have a waterproof wristwatch. We would have around our neck, we would have this plastic slate, and this slate would be around our neck, and we would have a grease pencil that as we would swim in on a beach, we would take the grease pencil and mark what would be the various depths using the lead line, what the soil was like, what kind of obstacles there were. We would swim in on a beach, and the way we would do it, we would all be boarded, or we would be aboard a ship. And then they would lower the rubber boats would be lowered into the water. And I should say the APD would be lowered into the water, and then they'd take a rubber boat out of the APD and tie it alongside the LCPR, so that the LCPR, the landing craft, 40-foot landing craft, would have a rubber boat tied alongside it, would have a platoon of frogmen, or I should say UDT, we were called frogmen, as many people know. It would parallel the beach, maybe about a half a mile offshore, and the platoon of frogmen, one by one, would climb into the rubber boat as the boat was paralleling the shore, and there'd be a sign given that the first swimmer would drop in the water. Then about 25 yards later, a second swimmer would drop in the water. And pretty soon all the swimmers would be along half a mile offshore in the water, swimming in daylight, under fire, under Japanese fire, and they would swim in all this time swimming down, seeing what the depth was with their lead line, taking the samples, and trying to stay underwater as much as possible. We had a tremendous number of breathing exercises. I personally could stay underwater about 2.5 minutes. We had people who could stay under 4.5 minutes. But then we, come up and get our breath and then swim in a little more. And again, all this was under daylight and under fire. And then at the appointed time, after we swam in and had our samples and got an idea of what the shoreline was like, we would swim back, and we'd all be in a row as the LCPR, the landing craft, would come by at about 5 or 10 knots and have the rubber boat alongside, and there'd be one heavy-set frogman at the bow, and he would be carrying a big rope, about 2-inch rope, that he would hang over the side, and they would come along and pick up one swimmer after the other. By the rubber boat would have this man holding the loop out for the swimmer, and so as the boat came by, you'd put your arm over the rope and grab it like that, and the force and the momentum and the speed of the boat would just carry you right up into the rubber boat, and you hopped out of there as quick as you could, got into the landing craft, and then the next swimmer would come in. Well, that pretty much was the role of the frogmen during the war. And then it was time for me to report for duty, and I reported to Team 21 to replace a wounded officer on the team. I joined them over in the Okinawa group. I joined them at an island of Ieshima, the very last island that was landed upon in World War II. And when that island, which fortunately there was no Japanese opposition on that island, and when that one was done, we came back to the ship. We all figured that we'd be going home because we thought the war was over, but no such luck. We sailed into Tokyo Bay in August 28th, 1945. Our role was essentially like it was in the other islands of the Pacific, was to make it secure and safe for our troops to land. And we were the very first Americans that the Japanese had seen. And we went up and down the coast disabling armament of any kind. And the interesting thing, we've all heard of the kamikaze pilots, the Japanese in desperation to try to save or try to win the war, had these pilots bombing our ships. Well, they had the equivalent of that with boats. And lining the shore of Japan were caves, dotted with caves. And in these caves were literally hundreds of suicide boats. They were like 20-foot long wooden boats with like an automobile engine with no reverse in it. That they would roll these boats out of the caves if the invasion happened. When it was ready, they would load them with explosives. And these young pilots, 15, 16, 17, 18, who had volunteered to give their life for the emperor, would climb into the boats. And I have to tell you that when we destroyed hundreds of suicide boats as well as midget subs, we also destroyed mines and torpedoes. And yes, I will say one thing: the atom bombs were horrible. It's really a shame that they had to be used, but the Japanese were ready to fight man, woman, and child to the end for their country. And had we tried to invade Japan, there would have been millions of lost. There would have been 1 million Americans, are the estimates. So it would have been catastrophic, and it was horrible. But to drop the bombs, but the alternative was even more horrible. Now there's a couple of things that people have asked me. Well, what have you learned through your experience? What has it taught you? Well, I'll tell you one thing, joining the Navy and joining the underwater demolition truly made a man out of me. I shuddered to think what would have happened had I not gone into the service. For that reason, I've been a proponent. I don't think it'll ever happen, but I wish it was possible for every man, and now even today, woman, at some point in their life, to have military service, because it teaches you so many things. It teaches you discipline, how to get along with your fellow man, a sense of responsibility. And so it's given me all those things, and I'm really grateful for it. My Navy career is something that I cherish, and I've lost some friends in the service as well, and I'm glad to be alive, and I'm glad to making a contribution to our country today.
I went in the Navy when I was 18 years old, and that was in 1940. And I joined the Navy primarily to go to the Naval Academy because one of my buddies in high school had gotten a book called the Blue Jackets Manual. And this Blue Jackets Manual, I was fascinated by it. And it said that they take 100 men from the fleet to go to the Naval Academy each year. So I figured, hell, I'm as smart as as 100 people in the Navy. So I did go in. Unfortunately, I went aboard a destroyer, and we have a picture of that destroyer. Many people don't know what a destroyer is, but I went aboard this ship, and we ended up in Pearl Harbor. And I was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attack. And there is a map that shows what the ship I was on and where it was located in relationship to the battleships that were hit. So I have the somewhat bad distinction of saying that I waved to the first Japanese torpedo plane pilot, and although that was 60 some odd years ago, I can still see him looking down at me. So unfortunately, I thought it was the Army Air Corps practicing, and it was a drill because I was up on deck going to get ready to go to church. The whole thing started about 5 minutes before 8. So I did see the beginning of the action. And obviously when I figured out that it was not a drill, and I figured that out when a second torpedo came down and hit the battleship Oklahoma, and after the second torpedo it managed to tip over. So and by that time all hell was breaking loose. We were being dive bombed and all types of bad things were happening, and the torpedo was actually aimed at our ship, even though our ship was only 340 feet long. But they were primarily after the battleships. The torpedo did not hit the ship I was in, which was fortunate. So the thing I most remember, of course you remember a lot of things even after 60 years. The thing I remember was guys jumping off battleships and trying to swim with oil-soaked water, and also the black smoke. And another thing that I remember is that after the first strike, there were a lot of small boats in the water, and I'll be damned if the Japanese weren't strafing these boats, and I was pretty much naive and shocked that they had killed thousands of people, and they wanted to get the 2 or 3 people in these boats, Navy boats, cruising the harbor. So we had what was called a cold iron watch. We didn't have any steam to the boilers, and the bottom line was we got underway, but before we did it, I was also coxswain of this boat, which I had tied up astern. So the guy that was going to be our skipper, our engineering officer, the captain and the exec were ashore, just told me to get my boat out of the way. So obviously I had to do that all by myself. Normally I would call away my engineer and my bow hook, but everybody was occupied trying to cut down awnings still and firing at the Japanese planes. So I ran back to the stern, took off my clothes to my shorts, untied the boat, jumped in the water, pulled the boat over to the dock, and got it away from the screws of the ship. I then climbed up on the dock and ran up forward and jumped back on the ship. And then I started to cut down the awnings because we had awnings over some of our guns. And so then, of course, I ended up on the bridge, which was my battle station. And we did get underway, and we were the second ship out of the harbor, and like every other emergency, there was all kinds of rumors going about that the Japanese were out at the entranceway going to shoot us down, and there were Japanese submarines out there, and they were going to sink us and so on. Well, none of that happened, fortunately. So we stayed out all night, came back in the following morning, and it was a complete mess, the harbor, and I think we've got some pictures that will show that. And make a long story short, during the war, I ended up with 6 battle stars and got the Presidential Unit Citation. And I was sent back for officer's school. I never did make it to the Naval Academy. At one very, very bad battle, it was called the Battle of Savo Island off Guadalcanal, where we lost 4 cruisers. It was a night action. The commanding officer of our ship, who kind of kept me out of the Naval Academy, but he cracked up. Now, and it was a terrible scene. And I tell everyone, if you can remember, if you saw the movie Platoon, particularly at the end of it, when it was a night action, when everything was blowing up, and that's exactly the way it was on August the 9th and 10th, 1942. It was a horrible mess. And so we did go alongside one of the cruisers that was sunk. There were 4 cruisers that were sunk, and we took off survivors in the night with the magazines blowing up, and it was a very harrowing experience. And the next day we buried about 8 of those guys that had come aboard to be treated on our ship. I can still remember looking over the side of the ship, over the side of the bridge, into GI cans, and there were arms and legs in that GI can. So if this video does any good to anybody, I just would like to reiterate how terrible, how ridiculous, how just about as horrible as you can imagine war is, and it would to be just so ridiculous that, but we will always have wars, there's no question about that. I thought after World War II there would be no more wars, but for some reason or other we humans love to kill each other, and we always want what the other guy has. So, and if we're attacked, we obviously have to fight back. But I guess that's about all I have to say about this. My 10 minutes may be up.
Would you like to say anything more about your subsequent career in the Navy? Might be interesting.
Well, yeah, I did. I didn't go to the Naval Academy, but after this commanding officer was transferred off the ship, the captain came. I was only a second-class petty officer by that time, 1944. He said, "Well, or I'm going to send you to the Naval Academy." And I said, "No, well, Captain, I'd love it, but I'm too old to go to the Naval Academy, but I'm not too old to go back to Officer Candidate School." And it's called V-12. And of course, we'd been out in the Pacific for a long time, and nobody except me, a young guy like me who was really eager, would know what the hell V-12 was. So he says, "What the hell is that?" So I told him what it was, and so he says, "Okay, I'll give you your choice. I'll promise if you stay on the ship, I'll make you Chief Petty Officer," which I thought was kind of strange because normally you had to take a test and all kinds of tough things to become a chief. But he said, "I'll promise you'll become a chief if you stay on here, or else I'll put your name in for V-12." And my reaction was instantaneous. It was, "Please put my name on that V-12 list." So I ended up going to Officer Candidate School, and that's the reason I love America. You can start out as an apprentice seaman. Make a long story short, I got commissioned in 1946, and I retired as a commander. And with 26 years, and I realized I regret to this day I didn't stay in for 30. I could have retired as a Navy captain, but I got out because it was the mid-60s, and I think one of my sons was growing marijuana in the front yard, so they said I better come home and stay with the family now. So I did retire as a commander in 1965.
In the spring of 1943, I was in college, and I knew I was going to be drafted, so I took some aviation cadet tests, and I was inducted directly into the U.S. Army Air Corps. In May of 1944, I received my wings. I had just turned 19, and I was 19 and a half, and from there I went to B-17 first pilot training, transition training in Roswell, New Mexico, and in the fall of 1944 I was assigned a crew, and we trained in Gulfport, Mississippi for about 3 months. And basically the first pilot of a B-17 is also called a aircraft commander. In other words, we were like the captain of the ship. It didn't matter what rank anybody else was. You were the boss. And in January of 1945, when I was 2 months, 6 weeks, 20. We ferried this B-17 to Europe. I flew my first mission, which was to Frankfurt, Germany, on March 9th. I had an experienced co-pilot with me, and one of my favorite stories is when we came up to the initial point, or the aiming point, I tapped this lieutenant on his shoulder to indicate that I was going to fly through over Frankfurt and right through all the flak, which I'll talk about later. But we did get 12 holes in our airplane that day. One piece of shrapnel severed the navigator's oxygen hose. It went through the front of it, went underneath the control panel, bounced off the co-pilot's flak vest, so it was somewhat exciting. My sixth mission was to Berlin. When the 8th Air Force bombed Berlin, there were about 1,400 bombers in the bomber stream, and you had about 800 fighters escorting you to keep the German fighters away. And it took about almost an hour and a half for the bomber stream to get over the target in Berlin. And you basically fly a straight line from the aiming point to when you release the bombs. And the Germans, with these 88mm anti-aircraft guns, knew exactly where you were going to be. So they would fill a box in the sky with flak shells that you had to fly through. Our tail gunner was calling out where some flak was. It takes about 20 seconds for the flak to get from the muzzle of the gun to up at your altitude. So it was getting closer, and I made a turn to the left, and bang, there was the next explosion where we were. Anyhow, I had an engine, what they call runaway, that is the prop. I couldn't feather the prop, and that means that you've lost not only have you lost the power of the engine, but you've got this spinning propeller which creates drag. So there was no way that we could keep up with the bomber stream. And the one thing you don't want to have happen is sort of fall below the bomber stream, and you can be picked off very easily by a German fighter. But we crossed we crossed the coast on Holland at 12,000 feet, and fortunately, no German fighter spotted us. I flew my last mission on April 18th, which was to Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. I basically flew 20 missions in 41 days. During that period, in April, I flew 5 missions in 5 consecutive days, and I have yet to find anybody who repeated that kind of an episode. I received an air medal with 2 oak leaf clusters and battle stars for the Battle of the Rhineland and the Battle of Central Europe. In November of 1945, because we'd come back, it brought the fire of our B-17s back to the States. I was back in college as a sophomore and still 20 years old. Now, we had a nice Catholic tail gunner from Chicago, and he asked if we could, before we flew, sort of get together underneath the nose of the airplane and lean down and put our hands one over all of them, one after the other, and repeat the Lord's Prayer. And that was such a good idea before every mission, no matter who was on that. And we waited till everybody got there. If we had some people who were flying as extra crew members, we would say that Lord's Prayer out on the tarmac. in front of me. I never saw anybody else who did that. And another sort of personal acquaintance here, you know, I'm a kid who, you might say, had no responsibilities in life. There were people over there doing this job who had families and who had children. And, you know, war is kind of a teenager's and a young man's profession, because if you haven't lived life, you feel immortal, in a sense, under these circumstances. The 8th Air Force had 46,000 casualties, 39,000 people were missing in action. And after the war, a lot of those were in prison camps. But we probably lost approximately 26,000 people killed in action. So anyhow, my mother's mother, my grandmother, sent me a little prayer book to take with me. And you have a lot of time between missions kind of lying around with nothing much to do. And I kind of zeroed in on the 23rd Psalm, which reads, Voice 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
I joined the Army in 1944, the winter of 44, spring of 44. And after basic training in Fort Benning, I went to Camp Atterbury, where we joined, a lot of us ASTP boys joined the 106th Division. And we ended up calling it the Hungry and Sick, because we were. And the 106th Division was shipped overseas via New Jersey on the Queen Elizabeth. And then we were sent down to an army camp in England, where we did some further training. And then we were sent to France. And we drove through France to the Siegfried Line and took the place of the 2nd Division, who was being rested after their battles. And so we were in what they call a quiet front in the Ardennes forest. And so we were there as of about the beginning of December of 44, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose, and 4 German armies went right through us. It was called the Battle of the Bulge. And we were told that we had to retreat and go back to a town called St. Vith. But the further back we went, the more Germans we ran into. And finally, my buddy and I got a hold of a Jeep, and we were going to drive back to St. Vith, but we were shot at and shelled. And finally, some of our troops persuaded us to skip the Jeep because they said the roads were covered with German tanks. So we left the Jeep and joined some of our troops in the woods, the Ardennes woods. And we were there for a while, shelled, and a lot of those guys got hurt. And then we were told to dig foxholes, which we did, but it was in the middle of December, so it wasn't easy, but we dug a foxhole. I got a picture of that, which is very descriptive. And then we shot our guns off, and they shot their guns off, and it was a big battle royal. And suddenly everything stopped. It was silent. And somebody yelled, "We are surrendering." And we never thought of that, because we were going to try to find our way back to St. Vith, but the senior officers got chicken feet and they surrendered the whole unit. And it seemed that the 106 suffered 8,900 casualties, which was the greatest casualty toll of the war. And we were marched, not marched, but we were put down into this valley, and you can see all the men coming from different parts of the forest, all captured, all asked to put their arms down. And those huge stacks of arms and wounded guys. One good friend of mine had his face blown off, and I didn't know it until I saw him. He was in the next group, and we were just told that we were not to fool around. We were surrounded by German panzer units with guns and tanks. If we tried to do anything, they'd kill us. So we didn't do anything. And that night we spent a night in the Belgian barn, with 200 of us, because it was getting cold. If you'll remember, they had a cold snap up there. And then the next morning we were marched back into Germany, back towards Koblenz. And it was freezing. We camped out on the hill. The Germans all went inside with the dogs. We had dogs with us. And they left us on the hill. And luckily, I had an overcoat with me, so I didn't freeze to death. Some of the guys did. But the next morning, they gave us some hot soup, and we marched to Koblenz, and we stayed there through Christmas. And then we were put in a boxcar for 7 days, 7 nights, with no food, no water. And we ended up in Czechoslovakia. And we were in a town called Görlitz, which was a big POW camp, which had Russians, French, and English POWs in it. Big camp. And suddenly, we were there for 2 or 3 months, and suddenly we were told we were going to have to march back into Germany. And by that time, we were all starving because we didn't have any food. The camps didn't. The camp didn't have any food. And so we were all put on the road, and next to us, and over the hill, was a concentration camp being marched back. And of course, they had the dogs and the black Nazi uniforms with them. And we had German soldiers guarding us with no arms, one had no leg, from the Russian front. And I was sick, so I fell out, and I thought the guy was going to shoot me. He took his gun off his shoulder. I thought, well, goodbye. But he took his gun off to help me under a wagon. There were quite a few guys falling out because we were sick. I had dysentery and pneumonia. And when we got to Leipzig, the commander assigned me to a British lazaret. And that was a camp, that was a lazaret, that was a British hospital captured in Crete in 1940. And I was with them, and I had their last sulfa drugs, and it saved my life. So I stayed with them for the rest of the war. They were all British. One of the guys that I got friendly with in that group was a Jew from I think it was from outside Palestine. And one night we heard noises outside of the camp. We were in a German army camp, but they were all Russian and British prisoners, French prisoners. We heard the Americans out in the field. I mean, at night you could hear them yelling. And suddenly we were being shelled. Well, the Americans had it on in their maps that this was a German army camp. So they were shelling us because they were getting shells coming back. And so they killed a lot of these POWs. Not a lot, but quite a few guys were killed. We were in the slip trenches, in the trenches, air raid trenches. And so finally they stopped, and the German commandant of the camp and the British major who were the two highest officers. We got a big white sheet for them with 2x4s, and they marched down through the village, try to tell the Americans that we weren't fighting and we were POWs. And it worked, because in a little while, up the hill came a Jeep with a big fat American lieutenant driving it, and the two commandants, a major and a colonel. And they stopped the shelling, and we were liberated. And the Jewish orderly, who I was my buddy, he said, "Will you pinch me to make sure this is happening?" Because he couldn't believe this was happening. He'd been there for 5 years. He'd been captured for 5 years. So I hit him as hard as I could. I couldn't hit him very hard anyway. And he said, "You know, this is really happening. We're liberated." I said, "I know it." I said, "These are trucks." And I said, "See these trucks down there?" And we were liberated by the same outfit we relieved in the front lines in France, the 2nd Division. And these guys had been battling up through Germany to get to where we were. We were under Leipzig and Magdeburg by that time. We were being marched back and then sent back. We were on the Leipzig, the river, Magdeburg. And so that was my war experience. And we were shipped. I was the only American in that group, because they were all British, French, and Russians. And the Russians got terrible treatment. But some of them survived. Because we used to go to the fence and talk to them best we could. And so when I was liberated, I was I think I weighed 140 pounds. I was down from around 200, 190. I was down to skin and bones. They sent us back to Lucky Strike, a camp in France. I came back via ship to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where they didn't know, of course they didn't know who I was, but they processed me. I was missing in action in my family. They got a telegram from the War Department saying Bob is missing in action. So my mother and sisters and brothers and girlfriend didn't know whether I was buried over there in the Ardennes or what. Many of the guys missing were prisoners, were POWs, and they were alive, those of us who survived, which was most fortunate. So as far as my feelings about the war, of course I'd seen a lot of killing, and I'd seen a lot of concentration camps. I didn't see them there where they were, like Balsam and Gorlitz and some of those other places, but I'd seen them on the march, and I'd seen how badly they were. They were worse than we were, and we were bad enough. But when I saw they looked like gypsies, with the dogs trotting alongside them and growling, and the SS troops with their machine guns, Burp guns we call them. They were bad. So I was very fortunate in surviving the way I did. And so that's my war experience.
My name is John Sachs. I was born in Europe, in the Czech Republic, and I'm an immigrant. I came here in April 1940. Grew up in Vienna, Austria. As most people know, Vienna was taken by Hitler in March '38, and then he proceeded to persecute rather vehemently, and there was little choice but for me to get out, which I did via Prague in 1940. I said goodbye to my parents at age 19. They were both killed in concentration camps, and I came here in 1940. About a year and a half later, in October '41, I was drafted, and I have to say that I was very eager to go into the service. And after my basic training, I was fortunate to be chosen to to go into the mountain and ski troops which were being formed in Fort Lewis, Washington. Our training, ski training, mountain training, was up at Mount Rainier. The people who taught skiing were were European for the most part, or at least to a great extent. They were some of the world's best skiers, a terrific bunch, coupled with people from Eastern and Western schools who had the money to ski, which was a rather expensive sport in 1940. Our training was vigorous. The equipment was poor. The Army, in its usual difficult way, gave us equipment that just did not do the job. And it took about a year and a half or so to get better equipment. We had, for instance, everything had to be carried in the mountains. When we were stationed at about 5,000 feet, we went up to about 11,000 feet. And we had slept out in pup tents in the snow and had K-Bucks sleeping bags, which got terribly wet and very heavy. So we really couldn't ski with a rifle and K-Buck sleeping bags on our back and many other things. This was corrected. In the meantime, a training camp was built for us in the Colorado Rockies, Camp Hale, and the rest of the division, we were only one regiment, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment. And in the meantime, the rest of the division had been formed in Colorado, and when we came back, it was now a full division, the 10th Mountain Division. We trained some more, were sent to the California desert, were sent to Camp Swift in Texas, all kinds of places which didn't seem to make sense together. And then in late 1944, we were sent to Newport News and shipped to Italy. This was around Christmas time. We arrived in Naples the first couple of days of January and were shipped up north. The front was up near Leghorn, Livorno, Pisa, that area in the Apennines, which go across to the Adriatic, and apparently that's where the front line was. We were shipped in boxcars and arrived, and some time later we were used, and really there is nothing unusual to tell, except combat is a very bitter thing, until we hit a snag. There was a town called Vidice and a mountain by the name of Mount Belvedere, which had to be taken, and the Allies couldn't get through. And this was in a range, part of the Apennine Range, where there was just no way through. I think it was called the Gothic Line. The Germans held that line very well, and the only place to get through was a rather high, about 100-foot stone wall, which had to be somehow climbed. Now, we had some excellent climbers, mountain climber squads, and one night, it was called, I believe the place was called Rocco Cornetta. These squads were able to climb the wall with rifles, Browning automatic rifles and grenades, get over the wall, and the Germans were just totally surprised. They thought no one could do this. This broke the resistance. These people who climbed up and opened this line just had the Germans running, and then the rest of the armies that were, it wasn't just our division, it was the Fifth Army and others, which advanced from then on with some degree of ease into the Po Valley. The Po Valley is a very wide very fertile basin with the Po River running through about the middle. And the last major obstacle we had was crossing the Po. We crossed, although the engineers came and put some pontoons down, the Po Valley, the Po River was inundated with mortar fire and other not missiles, but with all kinds of fire. But we made it across. I just want to say that some of the occurrences during this period and were incredibly difficult, and this doesn't need to be particularly said, but we were strafed by German planes on our way up the Po Valley. We were in single columns on both sides of the road, and a group of about 3 or 4 German planes swooped down on us, and I don't know whether any of you have ever been subject to that horrible noise as they swooped down on you. We, of course, climbed into the ditches on both sides of the road and tried to just become part of the ditch. They turned around and did it again, and turned around a third time and again did it. And this was, and we were told this was April 1945, a month before the armistice was signed, and we were told that the German Luftwaffe no longer exists. Well, that was a good example. There was no sign of the American Air Force anywhere. Quite a few people were killed. Running across clearings in the woods or elsewhere with all our packs. We were mountain troops. We had to carry most of everything ourselves. That included a little gasoline stove, and it included for every 2 people, and a number of other things. So we had very heavy packs, and it was rather cumbersome. The only method, other than on the flat, of pack animals we had were mules, and mules were treated in the Army better than most men because they had a certain load to carry and they wouldn't carry anymore, but we were unlimited. It wasn't funny. The stress and the strain during to withstand all this was incredible. My specific job was intelligence sergeant in the battalion, in an infantry battalion, which is, I don't know of any better way to say it, but the lowest form of intelligence, because from here on we are called S2 sergeants, and the job of our little squad was to establish observation posts as far forward as possible, and advise the battalion commander as well as the company commander of any machine gun nests or other places which should be cleared out. And also we had German prisoners come through, and I interrogated them because I spoke German, and we had a number of Italian farmers come through and try to get information from them, but it was very difficult. All they could say is Tedeschi portare via, which means the Germans took everything. It was a horrible time. It was an exciting time. And what can I say? How this war could be avoided, I don't know. And since the theme of this program is how to avoid, not how to avoid war, but anything is better than war. Sometimes I guess it's not avoidable. And I think we may even face a situation like that, although I hope that it'll be handled differently.
I was born in 1919 and grew up in the worst depression our country has had thus far. I went to work in New York in late 38. I went to work at Standard Oil of New Jersey, and from there I joined the 7th Regiment, the 107th Infantry Regiment of National Guard, New York's old 7th Regiment. We got sent down to Camp Stewart, Georgia, 11 months before Pearl Harbor. And when we were down there, I realized that that isn't where I wanted to be in the war, which was coming in Europe, obviously. The Air Force brought a recruiting trailer into Camp Stewart in June of '41, still well before Pearl Harbor, and allowed us to sign up for the Air Corps to become flying cadets. I became a navigator in February of '43. Got my wings and my commission. I taught navigation for over a year because they wouldn't let me stop teaching. And then I ended out in a place called Muroc, which was on the edge of the Mojave Desert. And it's an airfield that today is known as Edwards Air Force Base, but in those days it was Muroc. And there I put my word in that I wanted to join a senior pilot if possible. And they told me to wait a little while and they would find a good person, and by gosh, Captain Arthur George from South Carolina came in, and he had 4,000 beautiful hours flying time. And he was just as much interested in me as I was in him, because I had been teaching navigation after I got my wings for more than a year. We put together a senior crew, and we were sent over to Hickam Field in Hawaii, and from there to the island of Kauai, which is the most northern western major island in the Hawaiian chain. And there we picked up our airplane, a B-24 called Pacific Passion, and that, of course, is where our interests mostly were, in the girls of the world, and make sure that no beer glass had a chance to evaporate. And we got together as a crew. We got to know each other very well. Our co-pilot was Dutch Goza. Our bombardier was Douglas Vanderpool, and for some reason we never called him anything but Puddle. And we went on to Kwajalein as a crew in our B-24, and a word about that airplane, it had something known as high wing loading, which meant that it couldn't glide very well. It had 4 wonderful Pratt & Whitney engines, but when they weren't working, the plane would fly like a rock. And the sad thing about that was that we were going to fly over a lot of long Pacific runs, and that meant that if we had to ditch, we had about 8 or 9 seconds to get out of that airplane before it would sink all the way to the bottom. So ditching was not something we really looked forward to. We went on to Saipan and Guam. We joined the 431st Bomb Squadron Heavy, as the insignia shows. We were with the 11th Bomb Group, the 7th Air Force. Our general commander was someone called General MacArthur. You may have heard of him. And we began to bomb from Guam a number of targets over the water. And then the big thing happened in late May or early June of 1945. We moved up to Okinawa. And from Okinawa, we bombed both China, strategic targets, and Japan. Our main targets in China was the Shanghai airport, because this is where the kamikaze bomb pilots would take off and bomb our fleet, which was in the China Sea. Also, we would bomb the major seaports along the China Sea coast. The thing about China I will never forget is that we were a squadron leader. I was squadron navigator. My pilot had become squadron commander. And as lead plane, we had to go in, and when we released our bombs, all the other planes would release theirs based on when we let ours go. Puddle, our bombardier, was really good, and he had to be on automatic pilot when he went in to make a bombing run, and this meant that for 40 to 45 seconds, Puddle had complete control of our airplane on automatic pilot, and what he'd do is vary a little bit to the right or the left or up and down, so his bomb sight gave him an accuracy, And this was a problem because 40 to 45 seconds in the straight and level, varying our speed just a little bit, gave the Japanese plenty of time to line up to where we'd be 2 or 3 seconds from now. So it was a dangerous situation. We countered that technically because we had something called chaff or window, and these were long filmy strips of metal, silver metal, that we called window because we used to feed it out of the waste windows of our bomber. And this did a very good job of disrupting the Japanese radar and made our run safer. Well, on one mission to the Shanghai airport, Shanghai as it was called, our automatic pilot went out as we were flying over the China Sea. So Art had to call up the wing threesome to take our place, and we dropped back and took his place. And they didn't get their window out fast enough. And by the time they got in range of the Japanese guns, the lead guy got hit directly, blew up, remnants fell into the China Sea. His wingman had part of his wing taken off, so they flew straight into inland China and bailed out. We were told that we could probably survive if we could get to a point where there weren't pockets of Japanese. Well, we had this silk banner with a big red American flag on it with 5 different languages, all saying that we were in the business of trying to defeat Japanese tyranny, that if you catch us, please try to get us back to our base so we can continue our war against Japan. Well, we were in Okinawa when we heard that the bomb hit Hiroshima on August 6th. And the general reaction of the squadron was, wow, maybe this damned war will be over at last. Not so. We were told 2 days later that we were to take off the next morning at 7:40 in the morning and go to a place called Iwakuni. We took off at 7:40 from Okinawa up to Iwakuni, our target, and as we were flying up the east coast of Kyushu, Moxie, our nose gunner, yelled out. Now, Moxie, his name was Jack Meyer. We called him Moxie because he had so much. And so he was our major observer. He was the first person because he was in the lead of nose of the lead airplane. And Moxie cried out, "Oh my God, I just saw, the Earth has just exploded at 9 o'clock. We all went over to the nearest port we could see, and we saw brilliant shards of red, of orange, of green, and blue going across the sky. And as they faded, we saw a cloud coming up. And in a short while, it began to form into a large mushroom. Well, everybody said, "Jack, is that one of the atomic bombs?" And I said, "Oh, it can't be, because the nearest spot would be Nagasaki, and we're 90 miles away from that. And that mushroom cloud, as we watched it go up, would have had to go up to almost 50,000 feet, and that's just not likely. It's more than likely the city of Kumamoto being hit by one of our napalm bomb raids." So we went on up to Iwakuni. As you can see in the picture, we bombed it. We did a good job of destroying the strip again and many of the fighter planes. But after we succeeded and started to turn back, the crew started to work on me. "Jack, where was that? That must have been an atomic bomb." And I said, "Well, I just don't believe it could be Nagasaki because we were too far away from it." "Well, it had to be because it was such." And he said, "Was it one of the 5 cities?" Well, what they were referring to is Art George as the commander and me as a squadron navigator. We were giving the names of 5 cities that we weren't to fly within under any circumstances whatsoever. We began to talk, and we realized it had to be the atomic bomb. We got back to Yantan Field in Okinawa about 3:30 that afternoon. pulled into our revetment, got out of the plane, and we were met by our crew chief, Pop Weiss. We called him Pop because he was 31 years old at that point. And Pop said, "Gentlemen, they dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki at 12 noon. I'm with a designated job of being the timekeeper." I said, "No, Pop, it was 11:03. And then I guess we all began to think what it was that we had seen. And there's no question, but the sight of this bomb got into our hearts and minds in a way that we'll never forget it. Even after 55 years, I still think of it. What a way to try to end this terrible war. We never will forget it. And I guess I should be glad they used the atomic bomb. A lot of people said we should not have, because it did make the Japanese give up a lot earlier.
I turned 18 in May of 1943 and graduated from high school in June of 43. And then in July of 43, I was drafted into the Army. So into the Army I went, and into the A-12 program, which was subsequently called the ASTP program, Army Specialized Training Program. We then, finishing basic training, our group was sent to the University of Maine. It was supposed to have been a 2-year, 3-month program, after which we would receive an engineering degree. It so turned out that the program was canceled about 2/3 of the way through the 13-week first semester that we had. And by the following Wednesday, we were out on Tennessee maneuvers. That was a quick switch. I never saw the Army work that fast. After the Tennessee maneuvers were over, we went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for advanced infantry training. And that went on for about 3 or 4 months. Finally, right after D-Day, we were taken up to Camp Shanks, New York, to disembark for Europe. We were one of the first outfits to land directly in France, Cherbourg, without going through Great Britain. We made our way across France. We rode in trucks. We got to a place called Nancy out in the Lorraine section. And I remember the first day of combat was very unusual. We didn't know where we were going, didn't know what the objective was, but we turned a corner, and there it was. It was a big open field, and we assumed that our objective was a field up the hill up ahead of us. We lost a lot of people that first day. That first evening, there were 4 of us from ASDP in that one squad. One of the fellows, Matt Perry, out of New London, got the back of his heel shot off, and he began crying for his mother. It was a terrible hour and a half. One of the other fellows in our squad, Wally Roten from Wilmington, Delaware, went up and pulled him back, but he had bled to death. Wally Roten was awarded the Silver Star posthumously because a day later he, in turn, was killed by a sniper. The 4th person in the squad, Al Gavin, came from Allendale, New Jersey. We lost him. We didn't know where he was. And about, well, I'd say a month later, I received a letter from his parents saying, Alan is missing in action, and we wondered if you could tell us what happened. So my lieutenant told me, I went up to the lieutenant and said, can I answer this letter? He said, well, you can't do that. You've got to wait till the war is over. So when the war was over, I did call up Alan's house, and his sister answered the telephone. So I said, I'm calling about Alan. She says, Alan, he just left. He was home for 45 days, and he's on his way to Camp Gordon. Turned out he was taken prisoner. So with the 4 of us in that squad, 3 of them gone, if you will,
I was made the platoon runner. So instead of being in a rifle squad, I was a messenger for the lieutenant, the platoon leader. This thing went on for probably 3 days, back and forth. At night, what the Germans would do is they'd run their tanks. So you think they were all going to be coming over the hill. But they just ran their tanks back and forth, I guess. 2 of the tanks did try to come across, and they were taken out by an anti-tank gun that was located where we had turned the corner. And then another night, a tank came around the side of the hill, and we were able to get it with a bazooka. And the two Germans crawled out of the tank and tried to make their way back to their lines, but we were able to capture them as prisoners. During the first month, we never really knew what our objectives were. It was, you go left, you go right, you take that hill, you defend that hill. But finally, I guess after a month, we were finally told we're going on a big winter offensive. Patton's Third Army is going to cross the Saale River, and we're going to go all the way to Berlin. So we did have some idea what was going to go on. It was going to be forward motion. The big artillery barrage on the morning that this thing was beginning, and then the engineers had set up a bridge for us to cross first thing in the morning. As soon as dawn broke, we started off. It was, again, it was a terrible, it was like 4th of July. Artillery, tracer bullets. We got across and probably made progress for about a mile until we came to this little village. And the lieutenant that I was with said to me, "Ha ha, I finally got hit." We had come up against a haystack that was a disguised machine gun nest. And we were right up the base of the haystack, and somehow he got something got him in the arm. So he said to me, "Ha, I'm going home finally. Please tell Joe Schmo to take over." Turned out he did go back. I thought he had made it, but then found out that he had been killed by an artillery barrage when he got back to the bridge. Another experience we had, in fact, you wonder as you entered some of these villages where all the people were, where all the French people. And we finally found them. We were going to take this big hill up on it was a farming village. So we were able to get in there, and the Germans had vacated it. There was no fight. So the French came out of the basement, and they were offering us wine, apples, cheese. The girls were out on out in the street having a heck of a time. And all of a sudden, the German tank came up the other side of town. And so we all scattered, and that became a tough night. We had machine guns set up at one end of the tent. They had their tank at the other end. And the next morning, dawn came. The Germans had cleared all their dead off the streets. They had taken the tank, it had gone. And the only thing we saw right near company headquarters was a dead German who had in his hand we call him a potato masher, a German grenade. And he was in the process of apparently going to throw it down to the basement that the company headquarters was in. And he got shot by one of our fellows. So I bent down the next morning, and I got my first booty from war. I took his watch. My watch had broken, so I took his watch, and I was able to keep it for probably 3 years. Finally, one night, it was snowing, cold. We were dug in the side of a hill, and for the first time we had U.S. tanks around us. We were dug in amongst the tanks. It was so cold, my foxhole had running water in it. And the company
company captain said, okay, we're going to take turns. Some of you guys come down off the hill and you can sleep in this farmhouse that we have. So I took my 2 hours, went down to the farmhouse, climbed into a bed, took off my shoes, of course. When I woke up 2 hours later, my feet had puffed up. I couldn't get my shoes back on again. Apparently I had cut off my circulation over the prior couple of weeks in all the cold weather and wet weather. So I went back all the way to England, and it took about, I'd say, a month and a half, 2 months before I could walk, and then it took another month and a half before my feet get back to normal. I lost the caps off my 2 little toes. They turned black. So then I stayed right there at the hospital, and I became a chaplain's assistant at the hospital, and that was a far different experience for me than it was prior to that. I got home and finally was discharged in February 1946, still 20 years old. One of the things I thought about, I was with the Yankee division. I lived in the Boston area, and I wondered how my parents took all this. And they have a son who's over there in the infantry. An awful lot of publicity given in the Boston papers. What was happening to our outfit? And I remember my mother telling me that my father, when he received a letter from me that was mailed from the hospital, whatever date it was, he was so thankful that I was safe.
I started in active duty in November of 40. I was in the reserves, called up in November 40, spent some time, very profitable time, if there's time to tell you more about it later, at the Field Artillery Replacement Training Center at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The best experience of my 5 years in the Army. Hundreds of people went through my battery, thousands really, and I had a part in what they became. In the spring of 43, by then I was a major, I was transferred to the 102nd Infantry Division, which had been going about 6 months before I got there. We went overseas with the advance party in September of 1944, landed at Omaha Beach, but months after there was any fighting there, and went into Germany in combat, in heavy combat, on November 16th, when there was a large attack to try to break through the Siegfried Line. And it was there that I first realized that some of the things you could do as an individual could make a difference in the overall picture. The night after we captured Geriensweiler, which was a key town toward the Rohr River, the Germans, since we were a new division, sent a large party that captured most of A Company that was out at the point of digging, and they were digging in and they didn't hear the Germans approaching. The word got to the regimental headquarters, where I was liaison with the wonderful regimental commander of the 406 Infantry, Colonel Ben Hurlis. He turned to me, what can we do to fire? Just at that time, Lieutenant Evro Tarsi, forward observer with that company, called me and said that he was there. He hadn't been discovered. He could see what was going on. Most of the people walking around were our American soldiers. If we fired, we'd hit more of them than we would Germans. I told that to Colonel Hurlis. He said, don't fire. And some of those men were still around after the war to tell their stories about being prisoners. I made a difference that time. Later on, we were crossing the Rohr River, a combat crossing, very tough going, in February of 45. There was only one bridge left. My job was to get my battalion of guns across the river on that one treadway bridge. Shortly after we started, an anti-aircraft gun that was in with our column jumped the tread, stuck. Bofors 40mm gun. What to do? I had to get the guns across. I had stashed my battalion motor officer with 2 wreckers sheltered in German buildings near the crossing. Can you do it, Herb? Can you dump that gun without breaking the bridge? Herb thought he could. He did. We were the only ones out there hanging on the winch and stuff like that. He pulled that gun over. The bridge was free. I got my battalion across. I made a difference that night. Later on a more serious note, there's two bad times to be in a war. One's at the very beginning when people aren't ready. The other is at the end when they get careless. At the end, we had one company, another regiment, went across the river marching to Berlin. Everything fine until they ran into an ambush. And the dead and wounded were brought back to the river. The rest were captured and came in later. My regiment, Colonel Hurlis, going to be smarter than that. He said, I'm just going to send a platoon across and keep within artillery range, and we're going to just nose around there and see what's going on. So I said, Colonel, you saw what happened to the other company. Put one of your men up in one of my Cub planes to fly over your platoon and see if there's any ambush up ahead. We did that. They saw the ambush just as it broke, saved a lot of lives by seeing it before it got real bad. I thought I made a difference that day. It was a busy time. There were some difficult times. One of the most difficult, and yet it has an unreal feeling to it. Lieutenant Scott, one of my pilots, told me that he had an assignment to take a Life magazine photographer to Gardelegen, where the Germans had locked up 800 concentration camp people in a big barn, set fire to it. And when I got there a day or two afterwards, it was a strange feeling. Hundreds of bodies, no odor other than smoked meat. It was a sobering experience. Another time, we were in an area where the captain in charge said there was something funny going on at a slave labor camp. I went by the camp hospital. They had a record of 400 babies who had died in that hospital. Looking at the cribs of those that were still alive, I knew why. Because I'd left a 4-month first son when I left the States. These babies, over a year old, were no bigger than my 4-month-old son. They were being systematically starved to death. So in a mood to break the thing and make a talking point, I turned to the soldier with me and I said, you stay here. And the next baby dies, shoot a nurse. Well, the nurses became quite distraught and said it doesn't have to be this way. We could make them all live if only we had milk and food, which we'd been denied. So I arranged for the milk and left the area. I trusted it all worked out all right. That very same area, I stumbled in a town near the Volkswagen plant to the town headquarters where there was a harried lieutenant from the 30th Division that had taken the town with a well-dressed woman speaking very good English. And he turned her over to me, and her first words were, I demand some soldiers to make my Poles go back to work. And I said in my best English, Madam, you don't realize they aren't your Poles anymore. But what struck me was the mindset of someone who in the short years of the Nazi hierarchy had become so complacent with having slaves. It took our own people hundreds of years to really be complacent about it in this country. And we still aren't over that one. But that really shook me. I said earlier that my best experience in 5 years in the active duty was the training center. I was in a group of A Battery, the 32nd Battalion, of the 8th Training Regiment. 300 men for a 13-week course. A wonderful system was evolved whereby each Saturday, 1/13 of those men graduated and went to the Casual Out Battalion. The next day, Sunday, 1/13 number came from the Casual In Battalion. So there was overlapping experience over all those 13 weeks. And we used the coach and pupil method so that the 8th week guy would help the 3rd week guy. I thought that was what really counted, was that those of us that had some experience could share it with others and help them do better.
I was 19 years old in October of 1942 when I joined the Dutch Air Force. So I went down to the Netherlands consulate and they had a military attaché. And he said, yes, the Dutch Air Force is training in Jackson, Mississippi. I found out they didn't need pilots right then. So I opted to become a navigator. In the Dutch Air Force, if you were a navigator, you were also a radio operator. And in December '43, we were ready to go to war. We flew our destination was Australia. We flew our own airplanes to Australia by way of Sacramento, Mather Field, where our B-25s, because that's what we were flying, were modified with Bombay tanks and a tank in the radio compartment for the crossing from California to Hawaii. We made Hawaii, obviously. There they removed the tanks. Took about 3 weeks. And from then on, continued on down to Australia via Christmas Islands, Canton Island, the British Samoa, Espiritu Santos, and from there first to Brisbane, then to Canberra. But in May of 1944, we were sent to our combat base, which was called Batchelor in Northern Australia. It's today called Rum Jungle. We had a busy time. It was, we were assigned to the base for 8 months. It was not like it was in Europe where you flew a certain number of missions and then you were through with your combat and they either sent you back to the States or usually as instructors. We flew for 8 months. If you were lucky, it was not a busy period. If you were not so lucky, it was a very busy period. I flew 44 missions. There were periods when we had very heavy losses, and there were also periods where things were relatively quiet. Our missions consisted primarily of low-level shipping attacks, medium-level attacks on Japanese airstrips, and what we called high-level, which was 12 to 18,000 feet attacks on Japanese airstrips. I was in combat until January of 1945. After that, as a reward, they sent us back to the United States to pick up new airplanes. I was fortunate enough to make one trip all the way back to, well, we flew on ATC, the old Air Transport Command, back to San Francisco. I was fortunate enough to be able to get all the way to the East Coast and see my folks who were living in Larchmont, New York. Then it was back to San Francisco, pick up new planes, flew them back across to Australia. And I arrived back in Australia in June. No, it was before that. In May, at the end of May 1945. And we flew transport again with the understanding that in September of 1945 we would go back to for a second tour of combat. In August, they dropped the bomb, and a few days later, the Japanese capitulated. And it didn't take them long to figure out what to do with us. They put us to work flying for an organization called RAPWI, R-A-P-W-I, Return Allied Prisoners of War and Internees. And the story which I want to tell really concerns my experiences during those flights. Combat, obviously, was the original purpose and function.
but some of the lasting experiences which I have had were in connection with these evacuation flights. You've got to realize that there were, especially in what is now, which was then the Southeast Asia Command, there were a great number of civilian internees as well as Allied prisoners of war. The civilian internees consisted primarily of women and children who had been Dutch as well as Australian, who had been caught either in Singapore or Malaysia, or what was then Indonesia, and what was then Dutch East Indies and is now Indonesia. And these people had been put into, well, they were really concentration camps, and were pretty much left to their own devices. Minimal food, rice, fish heads, things like that. And at the end of almost 4 years of imprisonment, most of them were ill, underfed, many had died. There were relatively few prisoners of war who were generally treated better than the civilian internees. Our job was to fly these people back to Australia. What we would do, we would fly from our base in Brisbane to either Batavia, then called Batavia and now Jakarta, or Makassar on the island of Celebes, which is now Sulawesi, because that is where the camps were located. Ordinarily, a C-47 can take about 25,000 pounds useful load, which includes passengers and fuel. And with people of normal weight would be approximately anywhere from 30 to 35 people, 30 to 35 passengers. With the emaciated people which we had, especially with the children, we took 60 people without any trouble, some of which were stretcher cases, but most of them were on benches along the fuselage. I remember one particular instance where one of the nurses, we'd been into the flight about 4 or 5 hours from Darwin, where one of the nurses came up on the flight deck crying. She said, "I can't go on." I said, "Sit down, have a cigarette, have a cup of coffee, but you have to go back. These people depend on you, and you have absolutely no choice but to go back." Well, she finally quieted down, and she did go back. I remember her, I don't remember her name. Her first name was Mary, and she came from Canada. She was a very brave girl. At the end of the flight, when we finally reached the Australian east coast, about a couple of 100 miles north of Darwin, and flew down the east coast, which is really the only part of Australia, certainly at that time, that was inhabited. We would let the kids come up to the flight deck one by one so that they could see the city lights. And the expression on the faces of those children is something I will never forget. You know, they talk about the miseries of war. And war is a terrible thing, unfortunately, sometimes necessary. But the people who really suffer are the civilians, especially in cases like that. And I get more satisfaction, and I have gotten more satisfaction, I should say, about these evacuation flights than I ever did about the combat flights. The combat flights were rough, and you expected it, and we had our losses, but there was really no redeeming features. But these flights, evacuating, were tremendously satisfying. These were the flights that I remember. These are also the flights that made me aware of the, I won't say of the futility of war, because war is unfortunately sometimes necessary, but of the terrible ancillary suffering that goes on by people who have nothing to do with it.